It is just a simple fact that Nintendo have made some of the most iconic gaming controllers of all time. Some of Nintendo's most iconic controllers that immediately come to mind include the NES Controller, the Nintendo 64 controller with its 3 grips, and of course the Wii Remote, which upon reflection was probably Nintendo's most craziest concept for a controller ever. Actually no, I may have to take that back because the Wii U GamePad is also pretty crazy, but for very different reasons. But anyways, what I wanted to do in today's video is pretty much just go through all of Nintendo's home console controllers and rank them from worst to best. And before we even get into this, I just want to preface this video by saying that I think all of Nintendo's controllers are really good. Nintendo simply wouldn't be where they are today if they couldn't make great controllers, but nonetheless there are still some that I think are better than others, and that's pretty much what we're going to be looking at today. So without further delay, let's get into it. First up, as the worst Nintendo controller, we have the Nintendo 64 controller. Now, I love the Nintendo 64 controller. I think it has one of Nintendo's most unique and striking designs out of all of their controllers, but it's definitely not the most practical design. You see, the Nintendo 64 controller has 3 grips, and as a result of this, it's a pretty inefficient controller because as humans, we only have 2 hands, and what this basically means is that when you're using the Nintendo 64 controller, a third of the controller is pretty much always inaccessible to you, and in my opinion, I think that's the mark of a bad controller design. I will preface this by saying that for most Nintendo 64 games, this really isn't an issue because the game design is based around the controller itself, so there's not really any Nintendo 64 games where you need to access every button on the controller to play, but nonetheless I do consider this to be a design flaw. As well as this, the analog stick on this controller just sucks. It's really bad. Next up, we have the NES Controller, and this was Nintendo's first go at a home console controller design, and for their first go, I mean, this is an amazing controller, and it really set the standard for controller designs going forward. But having said that, I would argue that this controller really hasn't aged that well, and when you go back to it, it's pretty uncomfortable to play on for extended periods of time. I think my least favorite thing about this controller is its D-pad. It's just really sharp and isn't the most satisfying thing to press down on, but as well as that, the rectangle design of the controller itself is also a bit of an issue because those corners are also kind of sharp, and yeah, it's not really an issue when you're playing for a short period of time, but for any extended play sessions, this does start to become an issue. Next up, we have the Virtual Boy controller, and I just want to quickly preface this by saying that this is the only controller in this video that I have actually never held, so take this with a grain of salt, but I do hear from the people who have dared laid their hands on this thing that it's actually pretty comfy, and just by looking at the controller, I believe them. I think this looks like a really comfortable controller to play on. It's got those nice long handle grips, and I like that it's symmetrical on both sides as well with its button layout. I think that's cool. It's also got 2 D-pads, and not many controllers can say that, but yeah, other than this, I don't really know too much about the Virtual Boy controller, so I just decided to put this one here based on vibes pretty much. Next up, we have the Wii U GamePad, and this is probably Nintendo's most controversial controller of them all. And in my opinion, it has this reputation for good reason. The controller has a bunch of features in it which are just weird and not really that useful, and I would argue that all of the features it has is probably the worst thing about the controller because as a result of all of these features, it doesn't really have an identity, and I think it led to to a lot of game developers really scratching their heads as to how to effectively use this controller. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while the Wii U GamePad is ambitious in its design and it's perfectly serviceable as a controller, its biggest issue was that the games that were made for it were never able to fully take advantage of it, and I think that's indicative of a poor controller design. With that all said though, I do think the Wii U GamePad is an amazingly comfortable controller to hold, but with the way Nintendo marketed this controller, it really didn't live up to those standards, and as a result of that, it's really hard to put it any higher on this list. Next up, we have the Wii Remote, and this is one of my personal favorite Nintendo controllers of all time. It really is the perfect design for motion control gameplay. I think the long TV remote-esque design is just perfect for the Wii. However, where this controller falls short is with anything that isn't related to motion controls, because it doesn't have an analog stick on it, and of course you've got the nunchuck, which gives you that analog stick, but playing a game with this setup that doesn't utilize the motion controls just feels so subpar compared to a regular controller design, in my opinion. Another thing about the Wii Remote is that, specifically for 2D platformers, you can kind of use the Wii Remote as an NES controller by turning it on its side, and yeah, this works, but again, it's definitely not the preferable way to play these games. So I guess in summary, for the Wii Remote, I love it as a motion control remote, but I really don't like it as a remote for traditional gameplay. Next up, as the third best Nintendo controller of all time, we have the Joy-Cons. And I like the Joy-Cons for a very simple reason. They are just the ultimate all-rounder controller design. You can use them in a Joy-Con grip to practically replicate a traditional controller design, you can attach them to your Nintendo Switch to play in handheld mode, and you can play with them detached, and they basically operate like Wii Remotes when you do this. And I just think it's so cool that the Joy-Cons are so versatile that you can pretty much use them in any way you want. However, this versatility does come with one downside, and that is that whilst there's many different ways you can use the Joy-Con, I don't think it excels in any of them. Using them as a traditional controller is just nowhere near as good as, say, a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Using them in handheld mode is not as good as the Nintendo Switch Lite in my opinion, because that actually has a proper D-pad on it, and using them for motion controls is, in my experience, just not as good as the Wii Remote. I don't know what it is about the Joy-Cons, but I just find their motion capabilities to be less accurate and pinpoint as the Wii Remote. But yeah, other than that, the Joy-Cons are pretty damn amazing with how versatile they are. Next up, as the second best Nintendo controller of all time, we have the SNES Controller, and I've put this one so high on this list because I just think it's the perfect upgrade over the original NES controller. It basically fixes everything that was wrong with it. It's got curved edges, which are much more comfortable to hold. It's got additional buttons, including shoulder buttons for the first time, and it's just got such a nice, clean design to it. I just really love this controller. Obviously, it's very outdated compared to what we have now, but for the time it came out in, it is simply perfect. And in the number one spot as the best Nintendo controller of all time, we have the GameCube Controller. This controller is just awesome, and I really do think it's Nintendo at their best. The reason for this is because it does have a layout that is very reminiscent of modern controllers, but Nintendo has their own spin on it, and I think my favorite thing about the controller are the face buttons on the right hand side. I just love how there's the big center central A button, which is your primary input, and then all of the other buttons just orbit around it, and I think it's a really genius design. It just makes so much sense. In addition to this, I think the GameCube controller is Nintendo's most comfortable controller of all time, and even in 2025, it still holds up to modern controllers in my opinion. Like, I compare the GameCube controller to the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and I think in a lot of ways the GameCube controller is better to use, and obviously in a lot of other ways it isn't. For example, it doesn't have two shoulder buttons, but the fact that I'm even having that debate with a controller that's so much more modern than it is just testament to how amazing the GameCube controller is. And yeah, it does have its flaws, but I can easily look past them and confidently say that this is the best Nintendo controller. Anyways, that is it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to hit that like button down below. As always, there will also be a couple of my other videos on the screen to check out, and with that, I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.